Very warm welcome to you all for this afternoon session on stronger foundations. To what extent are funders applying a diversity, equity and inclusion lens to their practices, and a range of other topics I'm sure we'll want to look at as well. My name is Max Rutherford. I work for the Association of Charitable Foundations, which is the membership body for grant-making charities in the UK. I'm delighted to be contributing to this important two-day conference hosted by the Runnymede Trust, and I'm very grateful to my fellow panel members joining me today, Tracey, Agyeman and Jaden Osei-Bonsu, whose expertise and leadership have been very influential in securing real change to foundation practice. We look forward to sharing with you all some reflections on the last 12 months, where we think foundations are into aspects of diversity, equity and inclusion, and where we think these funders are headed. I'll make some brief introductory remarks looking at some sector trends before handing over to Tracey and Jaden for a more detailed exploration of two ways that some foundations are taking action. We really welcome your comments, questions and reflections throughout, and we'll aim to enable lots of time later in the session for these. So just a couple of minutes reflecting on the last 12 months from a foundation point of view. We know that charitable foundations in the UK contribute around £6.5 billion to civil society each year, a significant amount. It's about 15% of the charity sector's income. While some of this funding is always of crucial importance for many communities and organisations, the choices made by charitable funders in 2020 perhaps had far more direct implications for people's lives than in a normal year, and the ways in which organisations supporting people in extreme need were able to serve them. Many foundations increased their spending, with more than £1 billion allocated to new COVID-19 funding programmes. 400 foundations signed a pledge to stand with the sector back in last April, committing to a spirit of flexibility and support. And we at ACF very much hope these ways of working remain permanent features of foundation practice. Results from a survey of ACF members published just yesterday found that 9 out of 10 foundations plan to maintain or increase funding for civil society in 2021, which hopefully brings some degree of reassurance. The last year has shown perhaps more definitively than ever, that it's vital foundations are ambitious and effective with how they use their resources for public good. We know from our own research that foundations are striving to enhance their impact, but they tell us they have the furthest to travel in relation to embedding diversity, equity and inclusion in their practice. And these are also the areas where they aspire to make the most progress in the year ahead. Clearly, the last year has been incredibly challenging for the communities and people most harshly affected by the pandemic and the tragic consequences it has inflicted on so many across the UK. The support of foundations has been a valuable part of the response, not just the money awarded, but the ways in which that funding has been given. And we know what effective funding practice looks like. It's responsive, relational, collaborative, efficient, evidence-led and people-centered, alongside an acceleration of pace towards embedding action on climate change and inequality. As a membership association, we think a key part of our role is to ensure this progress becomes mainstream and permanent, and we look forward to working with many of you to achieve this goal. I just want to spend the last moments talking about the spotlight on inequality. 2020 was also a year in which existing inequalities in society were exacerbated and the spotlight shining on them was greatly amplified. The disparity of impact of COVID-19 has highlighted the urgent need for funders to consider this in their own grant making, both in terms of how decisions are made and how funding is allocated. The Black Lives Matter movement has pushed many funders to move at a faster speed towards addressing racism and racial discrimination and inequality, both within their own organisations and in how and who they fund. At ACF, we're making some progress in relation to diversity, equity and inclusion and our work on anti-racism, setting out last year our first public policy and targets on actions and plans, launching a challenging benchmark for our members on stronger foundation practice and creating a new learning stream to help our members take action. The last 18 months has also seen a flourishing of many initiatives within the foundation sector to redress inequalities, particularly on racial inequity and discrimination. Today, we will hear about two of these initiatives. These are clearly initiatives to celebrate, but is the fact that they are so needed a sign that we're closer or further away from achieving their aims? This is the question at the heart of our discussion today. So I'm delighted now to hand over to Tracey Agyeman from Equality Hours for our first expert contribution. Thank you very much, Tracey.
Max. Hi, my name is Tracey Agyeman, and I am the Programs Manager at Equality Hours. And part of my job is to manage the Secretariat for the Funds Race Equality Alliance. So in a nutshell, the Alliance is a group of funders working together to achieve race equality in the UK. These members include City Bridge Trust, Baring Foundation, Comic Relief, Children in Need, Trust London, Lytton and Bedfordshire Community Foundation. So it's different types of foundations working on different things and at different levels. How it started, it was back in 2015 actually, where the lottery brought together a loose alliance of funders because they were concerned about Brexit and the implications that came after Brexit, the rise of hate crime. And the common thread that was across the funders who were joining in that alliance was that they wanted to do something about the racial disparities in systems and in communities in the country. And when I first joined the group, which was about 2 years ago, the first thing we did was actually create a short-term strategy to help us identify what our long-term goal could be for the Alliance. So we created a scoping paper setting out to understand what the identity is of the Alliance, what are the desires, what are the hopes, and also what are the fears. We spoke to the sector as well, so race equality sector, we spoke to, I think, IMCON and Voice for Change, Traveller Movement, so different organisations operating in different parts of the country, representing different needs. And we wanted to hear their thoughts on the Alliance. Some of them never heard of the Alliance before, so that was interesting. And so the ones that who didn't know who we were, we actually asked them about their relationship with funders. A lot talked about feeling policed by funders. A lot felt like they had to retract the identity from the work. A lot felt like they weren't being listened to. So we took all these views basically, and then we also talked to funders themselves and asked them how they feel about their security sector and whether they've supported them adequately. So we brought those two views together and we bridged them together as well. And then we identified the gaps where we thought as an alliance we could address. So we actually set out three key priorities. So the first one is increased funder focus on race equality. What we realized was that funders weren't really sure what the sector was working on. And they weren't even sure as well as how much progress had actually happened. They weren't sure who was working on these issues either. The second priority was seeking more and better funding with a key focus on Black minority ethnic-led organisations. And the reason for that was many funders weren't even sure of police by funders how. So for example, an organisation told me that they didn't want to talk about race, they talked about diversity and inclusion. So police in terms of language, that's what I'm talking about. Have I answered your question? Please let me know if I haven't. But it was police in terms of language. So it was more better funding. And the reason for that was because funders weren't really sure how much money that they were given was actually going to race equality outcomes. And they weren't really sure what race equality was as well. So we wanted to address that. And then the third one was increase and sustain meaningful representation in the funding sector, because it's a very much white and male sector, as we know. So we wanted to find out how we could address these, the lack of representation. So we agreed collectively about the how. So we wanted to improve the practice, so identifying tools, resources, sharing best practice. We also talk about racializing philanthropy. Uh, we know that we wanted to facilitate knowledge exchange. We know that we wanted to improve the relationship between both sectors through whether it was research, whether it was through communication, scoping and projects. We also wanted to support the development of the sector's voices in the funding sector, as previously mentioned. So what did we do? So this was about a year and a half. We, as an alliance, agreed on what things we could do. And the first thing, under increased and a greater focus on risk equality, we actually commissioned a mapping of the risk equality sector. So this work actually takes place in COVID-19. So we want to, we spoke to organizations who were saying that there's a closing space because the sector entered the pandemic underfunded. So can't even imagine what it's like right now, right? So we wanted to find out what the closing space looked like because there was a concern about the fate of the sector. So we wanted to understand the players, the issues. We wanted to understand as well the relationship with funders. Has that improved, and where should funders be focusing on? And this is the context is England focused only at the moment, but we're looking to also expand that to different nations. And then within that, we also have quarterly meetings where we hear from different members of the sector to talk about what does racializing philanthropy look like. So we've heard from different organizations such as IMCON, for example, and organizations from Wales and Scotland talk about their perspective from their country. So we do that as well. And then seeking more and better funding. So previously mentioned, we know that historically the sector has been under-resourced and underfunded. A lot of organizations are applying for the same pot of funding historically. So we wanted to understand as funders, not me, but them, wanted to understand how they can track their project funding and core funding over time. So we created a funding audit. So the funding audit asks key questions. Is the grant holder led by minority ethnic community? It seeks a support. Will the funding benefit minority ethnic communities? What type of work will the grant be used for? Is it research? Is it services? Is it campaigning? And is it aimed at root causes, or is it aimed at tackling the consequences of racism? So the audit kind of gives a snapshot of what I've just talked about, and it really helps create a baseline in terms of where they are when it comes to racial justice funding. So we're actually releasing the first cohort of our results next week. So please follow us on Twitter to find out what these results look like. But a change that has come out of it, for example, is the Smallwood Trust. In the last 12 months, they've increased their funding to the sector from 7% to 12%. And that was just by doing this audit, just to find out basically what are they funding. The Lloyds Bank Foundation, for example, are also doing priority work and ring fencing, and they're also looking at what level, at what stage in the application process do Black and brown organizations fall kind of come out of the system and not successful. So how they can address that as well. So the audit has been very helpful for foundations, especially during this time of COVID. And I previously spoke this morning about an audit paper that we actually did. We basically mapped out the emergency funding that went out between November 2020 to March 2020 to find out the overwhelming funding and look at, what was it funding, why was it funding it, and is it sustainable? I can share that with you. I can share the report with you, but basically we're trying to advise funders what to do next, because, for example, the majority of the funding has actually ended. 20%, I think. Yeah, I think you're right, Fozia. So, so Lloyds ring-fenced 20% of their funding to go towards the sector, which was great. And we actually include that as well in our funding audit of the emergency funding, where we give advice to funders about ring fencing, about re-granting through organizations, about pre-additional support and the importance of that and supporting organizations along the way. And just it's basically about prioritizing organizations as well and targeting. So, but even though these things have been great, it's been also very challenging. So, like I said, we are a collective of foundations, and we want to look at how we can collaborate with the sector and increase dialogue and co-creating across our priority areas, which we have been doing. So, for example, with the funding audit, we worked with CORE, and then with our funding, the emergency pot, we worked with Ubele and Future Foundation. So we collaborate where we can, but it still remains a complicated thing because there is a power dynamic. And there are questions about who is and who is not and who should be at the table. So we're constantly questioning ourselves and asking the right questions. And also about, can expectations raised by the coming together of so many funders be met? Because when we talk about funders, we think about money, and it's like, where is the money? And is our funders really prepared to be open about their processes and to change their actual practice? So we haven't resolved all these issues, but it's very much at the heart of our dialogue. And it's about being open with each other, but also not staying in just a talking stage, but moving towards the action as well. So we're having these types of conversations. And we're talking about racial justice and racial equity and racial equality and where we want to be. My time is over, but just to say that we are revising our strategy now because we want to become explicitly a racial justice funding alliance, and that takes a higher commitment and a bigger requirement from us. And so that's where we're at right now. But yeah. Is the funding audit yeah, so the funding audit is basically a funder taking a sample of their grants and looking at how much of it goes to racial justice, and then the funding of the emergency pots is the funding that went out as a result of Black Lives Matter and COVID between November 2020 and between March and November 2020. So it's two different things, but I can send more information in the chat as well, and please contact me in the app thing as well. But yeah, that's to be done.
Thanks so much, Tracey. That's really helpful introduction to what's been a huge program of work, and I'd really encourage as many people as possible to read the report that's just come out. It's absolutely fantastic and interesting. And the data audit which you created, which a number of funders have used, I know has been really influential. For example, one funder told me that it had really sent a shockwave through their staff and trustee team that they were not funding the communities they thought they were funding. They'd made some assumptions that they were reaching certain groups, and actually it turned out they weren't. And in a different way, another funder was surprised that it turned out they were reaching some communities that they hadn't expected to, but it had been unintentional, and it led to some very interesting and challenging conversations among their staff team and their board about the lack of intentionality that was going into their grant making decisions. You know, it was sort of just by chance that they had kind of, in quotes, a good outcome from the scoring, but they didn't really understand why. So it is changing practice. Thank you very much for what you've done. Our next speaker, Jaden, is representing his experience today from the 2027 programme, but is currently based at the Centre for Knowledge Equity and may have some thoughts to share from his current role. So I'll pass over to you, Jaden. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Max. And I'm going to be speaking about the two initiatives, but I think it's also important to share some of the history of why I got into these roles and why it's important for me to be in these places. So with my background, I have 10 years experience within the youth working sector, and that's from growing up in South London. This is something I've always wanted to be a part of. And in 2016, myself and my brother, we put together a project called Project Elevate up in High Wycombe, where my brother now lives. And we was working with 8 targeted young people who the police had identified over the summer period. And we managed to get £6,000. And to us then, it was like a game changer. We had so much money, but as you guys know, £6,000 only goes a short way. So we funded managed to get a school that was vacant, and we was able to do different projects like football, music, very grassroots, very youth work orientated skills workshops with the young people. We actually employed the 8 young people, and following from that project, by the end of the program, we had 60 young people coming through our doors. The police at the end of that said it was the quietest summer that they've had in the area, and we was overwhelmed. Like, it wasn't easy, and it was completely just through passion that we wanted to create this. Following from that, we tried to apply for funding. No one would want to fund us. No one wanted to touch the program. No one wanted to give us support at the time, and we didn't know who to turn to. So for us, it was an immense frustration. And actually, there was a lot of things that happened due to that with the young people that we was working with. That was just that because they was in that area, there was a lot of trouble going on, and we felt actually we need to do something about this going forward. Which is why I went down the route of trying to understand the funding world. And at the time in 2018, I had heard of a program called the 2027 program. And that was brought together by the Centre for Knowledge Equity, 10 Years Time, and Choreo, some of the founding partners, to try and get more. It was aiming at getting more working class frontline staff members in grant decision making roles within the philanthropy sector. And for me, like, the grant making world wasn't something that I was interested in, but I just had this frustration with, actually, you know what, there's a lot of individuals in our communities doing the work that aren't getting supported or the funding. And just like myself and my brother, I had seen so many community leaders who have the relationships, have the trusted relationships within the communities, but weren't getting the funding to support their programs, and actually working over capacity to try and do these applications and these bids and getting turned away left, right, and centre. So then I applied for the program, and I managed to get a placement with the Paul Hamlyn Foundation. So over the last 18 months, I was placed at the Paul Hamlyn Foundation to understand the sector. And I think one of the biggest things around that is the program, the 2027 program, is UK wide. So if you haven't heard about it, I'll definitely say look out for it, because it aims at getting more people with frontline expertise into these positions so that they can understand the communities better. It's the 3rd or 4th year running, so it is a new initiative, but they're already creating some amazing conversations so far within the sector, and a lot of big foundations are supporting it, like the National Lottery, Comic Relief, the Paul Hamlyn Foundation, and a few smaller funding bodies as well. Over my time, I did a panel there, and it was called the Poverty to Solutions, and we brought 5 grassroots organisations to talk about their experiences with the barriers to funding, and some of the things that came out from that were about the journey and the accessibility of funds, and how difficult that it is to actually get to that process of gaining that funds, and why certain organisations were more palatable than others. And this really challenged the sector, but also exposed some of the issues that we were facing today. And then following my time from that, I've moved on to the Centre for Knowledge Equity, and that's all about working with grassroots organisations who have lived experience of specific issues, and supporting them with accessing funding. And that is working with funders, so the National Lottery, the Paul Hamlyn Foundation, and working with them to better understand the communities that they're facing, whilst supporting the capacity of lived experience leaders within the sector, and moving beyond just key terms. I know the sector loves to throw around key terms, but it's actually way more than that. It's actually, what is a lived experience leader, and like co-production, what is co-production? And I think one of the things that came up for us as well was supported agency, and telling stories better. I know my time in the charity sector, I had a huge conflict with, so I was working for Leap Confronting Conflict at the time, and sometimes the BBC, the media wanted to hear stories about knife crime, and for us it was just a straight no. It was like, no, we don't want to share young people's stories where they're opening up their traumas, and sharing things that actually they haven't moved on from, right? So like sometimes the sector wants to hear these stories to support their cases of why they're funding, but actually for communities, it's not the best place to share these stories. So how do we tell stories better and how do we find new ways of learning together. And one of the things that I've been learning at the Center for Knowledge Equity is the language. They had the language to decode what some of the organizations that we didn't have at the time. So when I look back to my project Elevate, we didn't have the language that funders would be responsive to, and we didn't understand what we was doing, but we knew we was making an impact. We just didn't know how to describe it in a way that funders would be receptible to. So again, a little bit more about the Center for Knowledge Equity. Baljeet Sandhu is also going to be delivering a session tomorrow. So if you want to hear a little bit more about that, but just their background has been around, they were involved in the Resource and Racial Justice Fund last year, and Challenge and Change, which is a fund that supports young change makers with the Blagrave Trust, and looking at new ways and reinventing how we give out funding and how the funding world can make it more accessible for underrepresented voices and communities to gain funding. And I think just to leave this space with a few challenges is some of the things that we've been thinking about, and some of the things that have come out of our conversations is how can we make that journey to accessing funding easier for Black and Brown communities? And then speaking about things like land reparations, building ownership, building community capacity rather than taking it away and with exhausting tasks. And then how do we celebrate difference better? So one of the things that came up is actually a lot of these spaces, foundation spaces, are super middle class and super white. And there's nothing wrong with being super middle class and super white, but how are we creating environments where we're celebrating difference so individuals like myself can thrive in those settings? Because at a time, I'm quite a vocal individual, but I reflect on my time at the Paul Hamlin Foundation, and it took me quite a long time to even find my voice, to even speak up at the table. And it's all well and meaningful to have even like young people at the table, but if they don't know how to take ownership of their voices and speak their minds, they're only going to say what the CEO wants them to say. So it's like supported agency. How do we support organizations to upskill our people so that we have voices when we get into these spaces? And then again, like how do we get organizations to understand about influencing policy? Like some of the times, a lot of grassroots organizations are influencing policy. They just might not know that they're doing that. So how do we make it more aware for organizations to do that? And then the final one as well is how do we move into a space where we're explicitly becoming anti-racist? I think what came out of COVID and 2020 was the fact that a lot of organizations, Black and Brown organizations, were, whilst the larger organizations were thinking about strategy, a lot of our community organizations were responding directly to the issues that were elevated by the times and COVID. So how do we move forward and create more anti-racist systems that can be in place? But yeah.
Thanks so much, Jaden. That's a great introduction to that program, and hopefully the delegates have found both of those case studies illustrative of some of the ways that some funders are taking action. But I wanted just, while we gather questions from the chats, and please do feel free to put any comments or questions you might have for Tracey or Jaden in there, just to pose that first question to you from my remarks earlier. Do these initiatives indicate something to celebrate, and or are they perhaps demonstrating that the distance to travel is still very significant, perhaps more so than ever? Maybe Tracey could have a go at answering that.
My internet's quite slow. Can you repeat that?
Sure. Just the question of whether the increase in initiatives to address different kinds of inequality, particularly racial inequality in the foundation sector, is that something to celebrate in your view, or does it suggest we're further than we've ever been from achieving the goals of those initiatives?
That's a very tough question. Yeah, Sasha. Yeah, I think it's both. Sasha Lawrence is right. I think it's both. I guess the bigger question is that how we do it, and to understand that. I guess for me the issue is that we have to make sure that the space is as inclusive as ever, because this issue did, how can I say this properly, but just to say that Black and brown people didn't create racism, so they shouldn't fix it themselves, but at the same time they have to be at the table because it's about them. And the funding sector for a while has been doing things on behalf of and not with, and now I think we're moving towards a space where it's like, we don't know what we're doing, we're giving you the money, help us, lead us. And that's what I think needs to be more like. I mean, talk about ring fencing would have never been a thing last year, but it's now becoming the new normal. But the thing is that we have to stop making this work reactive work. Just because someone got killed does not mean then more funding should come. Like in this country, how we think about racism, it's very reactive. It's about, it needs to be sustainable. It needs to be a way of life, and it shouldn't be something bad happening. Therefore, where do you put the money in? It can't be like that. So these initiatives are great, don't get me wrong, but they shouldn't be there to begin with. And so, but they are, and that's life. But at the same time, it's who then is around the table to create these stuff moving forward. I guess that's the answer. I don't know if I answered it properly. It's quite a big one.
Yeah,
I would love to jump in on that as well. I think it's also about readiness, like how are organizations acknowledging what's happened and like the readiness to act. I think we can get caught in a thoughtful stage and like no action being taken. It's like actually sometimes we need to like think fast and be able to create actions, and bring the right people, like Tracey said, bring the right people to the table rather than just extracting from communities, paying them for their time but not letting them manage the work. It's actually like how are we how are we working with communities as partners to get the job done, and changing the way we view giving out grants rather than grantee and grant manager. It's like we're partners in this work. We should be making your job easier in doing what you're doing rather than taken away from your capacity.
Thank you both so much. So yeah, please do post any questions, comments you have. We were going to have a quick poll at this point just to ask you whether you thought foundations in the last year had stepped up or not, and that question was posed by Runnymede colleagues in the chat, but do feel free to put your own views about that in there. There was a poll recently at a different conference that was partly organised by the National Lottery Community Fund, where they asked that question of a general charity audience, and the answer that was given was sort of strikingly supportive and favourable towards the foundation sector. You know, actually, even for us as the membership body for foundations, we were surprised by how positive the response was, and while that's to be welcomed to an extent, it perhaps struck us as slightly curious in a way that it was as positive as that, and what might the reasons be behind that sentiment being expressed. So it'd be great to know from this audience too whether that is the case. So just going to have a quick look in the chat. We'll come back to those questions in a moment. The question I had for you both, this question about long-term funding versus short-term emergency response. We know that a lot of funders a year or so ago, in their effort to respond quickly and to demonstrate they were responding quickly, created standalone COVID-19 emergency funds, and that in many cases that was welcome. A lot of organisations did benefit from some of that funding, but there were instances where some of that money was repurposed from programmes that otherwise would have happened during the course of the year. That meant other organisations missed out. There's now concern that there is a sort of cliff edge emerging for some of that emergency funding. What would be your message to charitable foundations who perhaps are unsure right now whether to continue with the sort of emergency COVID focused response or to revert back to what they might think of as their normal programs, and how to balance those two competing pressures? Perhaps Jaden might want to start with a view on that.
Yeah, I think one of the things is going beyond like the theme of the emergency response and seeing what we can learn from the emergency responses in terms of money got out quicker, phone calls and check-ins increased. So like, what can we learn from the emergency responses, and how can we take that into our day-to-day practice? So I think we should be moving and emerging forward out of that, but also thinking about new ways of funding, like looking at our criteria, looking at what we fund as well. So I spoke about land reparations and organizations, community organizations buying buildings. The Birmingham Civic Centre or Birmingham Civic Square, ran by Imi Kerr, they own the land that their community centre is on. Like, why can't we look at new ways of remodeling how we're giving out funds? And I know there's loads of implications, but that's just a challenge to the sector and some of the larger funders. Actually, how can we support organizations so that they become self-sustainable rather than constantly dependent on getting new ways of funding? How can we support them with strategy and income, diversifying their income strategies and just building their capacity, especially around Black and brown organizations who have been historically on the back foot within the funding space?
Thank you. Tracey, I know you've just published a really great report looking at the issue of emergency funding and its potential consequences. I don't know if you want to add some further thoughts on that dilemma that some funders are expressing between continuing with that short-term emergency type response or reverting back.
Yeah, so in the report, we make a few recommendations, and one of them is looking at the short-term but also long-term funding. So those two come they come together. So we're saying that within your emergency funding, talk about prioritization, keep with the ring fencing, keep with the pre-application support, but also apply those into your existing everyday, day-to-day funding. So, there's not that many. I think it's just one, if I'm wrong, but Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, they're the only one who have like an explicit fund that goes towards racial injustice, and that in itself says a lot. So it's about, if you are committing yourself to racial justice work, know that it's a generational funding approach, and that requires longer than 5-year funding. The cliff edge that you were referring to is so right. For example, we found out a lot of funding has finished in March 2020. So there is, the risk is here that many funds have finished and they haven't been renewed. So we are talking about addressing yes, fund the short term right now, but also think about what does the renewal look like? Because many NGOs I've spoken to say we don't know what else is going to happen after this, because we've asked them, funders are in that thinking phase. So we encourage funders to think, but also act at the same time. And the same way with your long term and the short term, it has to come hand in hand.
Thank you. I wanted to also pose a question thinking about the other part of many foundations' money, which is not their grants budget, which is probably the most visible way in which they deploy their resources, but the investments that they hold. And there's increasing conversation about whether foundations are doing enough to deploy their much greater asset, the endowment, the big pot of money that they invest in order to generate an income which provides the grants budget, whether they're doing enough to use that in a way that is fulfilling charitable objectives and indeed their own charitable mission. And I think the general consensus now is the answer is no, they're not doing enough. Most are investing in a fairly traditional way to generate a financial return, to provide this relatively small grants budget compared to that bigger pot of money. But there's some potential there, it seems to me, for foundations to think much harder about how they are intentional about using their endowments to further these causes. And one of the most interesting developments, I think, in the last year has been the Baobab Foundation, which is a new entity. It's got quite a big ambition, which is to raise a significant amount of capital. I think it's £1 billion from charitable foundations for its own endowment, so that in itself is self-sufficient. What could you say with regards either to the Baobab Foundation itself and its ambition, or your general view on ways that foundations could think beyond their grants budget to further some of this agenda?
Yeah, no. Do you know what? I think number one, like even endowments, if you look hard enough, there's a lot of ethical issues in what we're reinvesting into, which is kind of creating a cycle for the problem. And I think one of the ideas that some community organizations have been thinking about is how can endowments from foundations support socially driven startups? And I think like this is the first time I'm hearing about the Bao Foundation, but I think it's amazing. I think that those ideas of like how can we use endowments to regenerate and like support organizations, but also gives community organizations another outlet. So that if they want to create a startup, and like a lot of organizations are thinking about how do we become not just charities but build other social entrepreneurs with like that at the ethos of their heart. So that if there is work around that, that would be amazing. But I think it's just people are thinking about this now, and it's a new idea, and I think it's definitely something that could challenge the sector.
Yeah, I agree. I think there needs to be a priority approach to things. So the whole about the inside and outside work, I think they need to, again, there needs to be space for people to have different approaches to achieving the same goal, because racial justice looks very different for different people in different communities. I think it's great that Baobab is doing that because it's never been done before, but also to understand that that shouldn't be the thing in of itself. So there should be other approaches. And I think it's great that foundations are supporting Baobab in doing so. They actually released a report recently, which was great. And I encourage people to read it. But just to agree on what Jaden said, there needs to be clarity of approach. So even me working within a funding sector, I understand that I'm working within systems that Jaden might not want to work within systems, and that how do we both, achieve what we want to achieve, but also through different approaches. That makes sense.
Great, thank you. No, it's very encouraging that new models are being thought about. And Jaden, you mentioned earlier community asset transfer, use of buildings. I think there are a whole range of ways that foundations can step up their game beyond their grants budget to maximise the impact they can have with all of their resources. I wanted also just to give a reference, a shout out to Future Foundations UK. If delegates haven't heard of them, I've just posted a link to their Twitter page. It's a supportive network for people of colour working in the UK philanthropic sector to connect, create and lead change within the space. And they have, in a fairly short amount of time, had a tangible impact on the thinking across the foundation sector. It's not to suggest that there's been more progress made than there has in reality, but it does feel, certainly 10 years or so I've worked with foundations, that this is a time of acceleration towards some positive change. I've posted a link to their recent March 2021 statement of what they want to see happen this year, and that's from staff and trustees working within the foundation sector, which is extremely helpful voice to hear. So we're coming up to the end of our time. Thank you so much indeed for listening to contributions. And we hope that this can be a conversation that continues. If any of you would like to get in touch with me or with Tracey or Jaden, I think our contact details are being shared by Runnymede Trust. I'd really love to hear any feedback or any challenge to anything that has been said, but also your ideas for how foundation practice can be improved and enhanced so that those precious resources achieve maximum benefit in the difficult year ahead. Thank you again, and I hope you have a really successful and enjoyable first and second day tomorrow of the conference. Bye for now.